Hey there, Ryan Reynolds here. It's a new year, and you know what that means. No, not the diet. Resolutions. A way for us all to try and do a little bit better than we did last year. And my resolution, unlike big wireless, is to not be a raging and raise the price of wireless on you every chance I get. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited. See mintmobile.com for details.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon. Sometimes the most painful part of getting sick is the getting better part. Waiting on hold for an appointment, sitting in crowded waiting rooms, standing in line at the pharmacy. That's painful. Amazon One Medical and Amazon Pharmacy remove those painful parts of getting better with things like 24/7 virtual visits and prescriptions delivered to your door. Thanks to Amazon Pharmacy and Amazon One Medical, healthcare just got less painful.
Farah, I'm sort of curious. In Donald Trump's America, is DEI now a bad word?
Oh, I think there's plenty of people right now who are scrubbing it off their resume. Absolutely.
Farah Stockman is a member of the editorial board at the New York Times. And over the last few years, she's made herself into something of an expert on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Last week, of course, President Trump issued a pair of executive orders laying out his plan to dismantle DEI, both in and outside of government. Farah, I figured, could explain just how much history was getting unraveled here.
Donald Trump went all the way back to LBJ. He went all the way back to the executive order that Lyndon B. Johnson signed in the 1960s to say, hey, maybe we should not discriminate against Black people. That is an order that went away too. And so, it's bad.
The really striking thing about all this, to Farah, is that it was just 4 years back that President Biden was issuing his own day one executive orders, folding diversity, equity, and inclusion into the government's mission.
Oh my God, it's totally nutty to remember it. It feels like 1,000 years ago.
In a White House press conference, Biden said America had been blinded to structural inequalities for far too long.
Those 8 minutes and 46 seconds that took George Floyd's life opened the eyes of millions of Americans and millions of people around all over the world. It was the knee on the neck of justice, and it wouldn't be forgotten.
Biden said the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis had inspired him and others to do more.
It stirred the conscience and of tens of millions of Americans. And in my view, it marked a turning point in this country's attitude toward racial justice. When the 6 years old,
he commits its administration to this whole of government effort to look at equity and look at the barriers that the federal government might be unwittingly keeping up to hiring, to contracting, so suppliers, to grants, who's getting grant funding. And it wasn't just about people of color, Black people, Native people, Asians. It was about rural people. It was about disabled veterans. It was about religious minorities and sexual minorities. It was pretty much everybody except straight white men.
Turns out that over the last 4 years, a lot of those straight white men got anxious. Farah's talked to a few of them. People of all income levels who think DEI is fundamentally unfair, or might be the reason they can't get ahead.
I have heard of situations where a white guy wants to become a pipe fitter, and they didn't accept his application because they were only taking Blacks and Native Americans that year. I know it sounds crazy, but there's a reason that a majority of white people in this country believes that they are the actual victims of racial discrimination. It doesn't come out of thin air.
Do you think people who have been dissatisfied, felt left out by diversity, equity, and inclusion. Do you think these executive orders that Donald Trump has issued, rolling back these initiatives, are those people going to get what they want or expect?
I don't know. What does success look like in the government? You know, look at the people that are serving in the Trump administration. Do we really think that they're qualified for their jobs? His definition of merit is loyalty.
Today on the show, what diversity is going to mean in the Trump administration. I'm Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around. This episode is brought to you by Discover. Have you heard about Doublenomics? It's okay if you haven't. It is extremely niche and practiced by Discover. Here's an example of Doublenomics. Discover automatically doubles the cash back earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cashback Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back into $300. It pays to Discover. See terms at discover.com/creditcard.
This episode is brought to you by NRDC. Our nation's environmental safeguards face their gravest challenge ever. The new Trump administration is moving quickly to dismantle decades of protections for our clean air, water, and public lands. The Natural Resources Defense Council has proved it can stop these attacks. NRDC filed the first environmental lawsuit against the previous Trump administration and maintained a blistering pace, filing 163 legal challenges and winning victories in nearly 90% of resolved cases to protect wolves, bees, and other endangered species, block the Keystone XL pipeline, regulate chemicals hazardous to our health, and more. Now, NRDC is launching the legal fund to stop the Trump agenda. For a limited time, all donations will be doubled to help power their strongest legal defense of our environment yet. From climate protection to endangered species, what we do now will determine the world our children inherit. Make your match gift at nrdc.org/podcast.
You know, you've said that with the executive orders that Donald Trump's come out with over the last week, policy is basically being torn up at the roots. So I wonder if we should explain exactly what Trump is saying in these executive orders about diversity over the last week or so. There have been a couple of them. One bans DEI programs in the federal workforce and corporations with federal contracts, and the other directs the government to investigate DEI discrimination and preferences across the private sector. That first executive order, as you've noted, rescinds another executive order from Lyndon Johnson in September 1965, which basically put in place affirmative action for federal contractors. So tell me a little bit about how over the last week or so, we've seen government agencies respond to these orders, because it seems like they just go so far. They could touch on so many different aspects, from just like vanilla visual stuff, like whether you can have a pride flag up, to deeper stuff. Like, give me an example of what we're seeing from civil servants.
Well, basically anybody who worked for an office that had DEI in the title was put on administrative leave, paid administrative leave, as those offices wind down. But also the heads of those offices were told that they had to report on any other employee who may have at some point had DEI in their contract or title. And they have 10 days to report that, or there'd be adverse consequences. So they're sort of hunting anybody who might have changed their job description since November to sort of, find those people and catch them too.
It's been interesting to me to watch the interpretation of the executive orders sort of ripple across government. Like, one of my colleagues did some reporting, found the U.S. Department of Transportation had these policy statements on harassment prevention up on the wall, and those were taken down. Like, people are getting rid of chat rooms in their chat software that had to do with pride or LGBTQ life in the office.
And there are government affinity groups, too.
Yeah. You can see people just trying to figure out what can we say now and sort of erring on the side of being quite conservative about what they can say because people want to keep their jobs.
Right. And I mean, the federal government is, at the end of the day, it's a big jobs program, right? Like a lot of people work for the federal government. And so it's not just the people in these offices that are going to be affected. It's going to be everybody and how they hire in the future. And, they want to shrink the federal government. So maybe, this is just a start of how they're going to go about it.
One thing you've been really good at pointing out is how DEI efforts, equity, environmental justice efforts, things like that, they're not necessarily exactly what you might think about. They might touch on like core aspects of a government employee's job. And I was noting that in some reporting that was talking about like Forest Service scientists who were saying, we don't know if we can consider the impact of logging on roads in vulnerable communities now because of a DEI ruling. Can you just explain a little bit how DEI might get into some of these core functions of a job that we might not be thinking about right now?
Well, under Biden, the DEI directives were to look at how you handed out money. The Inflation Reduction Act or the American Rescue Plan, they analyzed how grants were handed out and whether they were sort of handed out fairly or unfairly, looking at different communities, underserved communities, whether there were barriers to money going to those places. So, any place that has received federal money for any reason has had some interaction with DEI over the last 4 years because it's been evaluated to see whether underserved communities got a fair shot at it.
Right. And we're talking about like rural communities, right?
Rural communities, yes. Native American communities, yes. Inner cities. And they looked at how federal money went out the door. So anybody who's been handing out grants for the last 4 years has been handing them out according to directives to be more fair. And they have like collected data on this stuff.
Yeah, I've been interested to see how the word equity has become a no-no word in this administration. Like in Pete Hegseth's confirmation hearing, he was really explicit about wanting equality, not equity.
Our standards will be high and they will be equal, not equitable. That's a very different word. We need to make sure.
And I personally don't think a lot of Americans know the difference between those two words.
Yeah. So his definition, Hegseth's definition was, so have you ever been in a social justice advocate's office and seen this cartoon where there's like 3 kids watching a baseball game behind a fence and one is really short and so they're standing on a chair and then one is tall and so they're not standing on a chair?
Yeah, I was going to talk to you about this cartoon because it's like so ubiquitous, but it explains really clearly how a lot of people think of equity, which is if there's a short kid who's trying to watch a baseball game, but they're just looking at a fence, you give them a box and then they can look over the fence.
Right. It's they're defining equity as equity of at the end, right? Equity of outcome rather than we all start in the same place. And Pete Hegseth says what's fair is that we all start in the same place, that we have a colorblind process that doesn't take into account race or any of that you don't have discriminatory barriers right out on the outset. That you don't have policies that say we don't hire Black people, right?
But we don't all start in the same place, do we?
We don't. And this is the silly thing about it all is that something like some huge percentage of jobs that people get, I don't know, I've heard I've heard 70%, are gotten through social networks. And so if you have to know somebody to get a job at a place, then, and everybody who works there is white, then the chances that you're going to get a job there is pretty low. And so, and this is not hypothetical. Like, a lot of union factories used to be like this, and to some extent still are. Like, they're a friends and family place where you literally had to know somebody in order to have your resume considered. And so I absolutely think there's been a cultural backlash against DEI that's bigger than Trump. But my main fear is that the cure for DEI is going to be worse than the disease. I feel like we're going to go back to the days before LBJ, and that's not a place I think we want to be.
Yeah. You've noted that the Democrats didn't really help with the backlash against DEI when they stopped explaining their policies and the value of them.
Yeah. I think that the messaging was all about representation. It's like, representation matters, yes, but it can't matter more than results, right? So they were tracking like people of color in the cabinet, but when you go and ask them, okay, how did that make our government better, you'd get greeted with a blank stare. I wrote a piece about how connecting people's backgrounds and their diverse backgrounds with what they were able to achieve in government. And it was harder than I thought it would be, because not a lot of people were asking that question. It was enough to say, we have the first Native American cabinet member, or we have the first Black woman as director of the Office of Management and Budget. But there weren't a ton of people out there trying to connect the dots and say, well, that Black woman is a better director of the OMB because of her life experience.
But you found that, right? Because it's like the woman who was the head of the OMB had all these relationships with people in Congress that she was able to leverage.
Absolutely. She was a Black woman from rural Louisiana. So she knew how to take care of rural people. She looked at the budget through the eyes of somebody who is from this tiny town very far from a hospital. And she knew about conservatives. She knew how to butter them up, how to talk to them. And so she had great relationships across the aisle. She had been on the House Appropriations Committee for something like 16 years. And so she knew a lot of these Republicans. And she is the reason, a lot of people told me, she is the reason that we didn't have a government shutdown under Biden, because she knew how to talk to those Republicans. That was just one example. But it was not that easy to find these examples because they hadn't been used to producing them. They were used to just saying, okay, we have a cabinet that's like 51% people of color. Even the diversity trackers, there were a couple out there just tracking. It was metrics, it was numbers, and it was hard to sort of find those stories that could make the case that, yeah, it does matter if your federal government is made up of people from different walks of life.
We'll be right back after a quick break.
This episode is brought to you by NRDC. Our nation's environmental safeguards face their gravest challenge ever. The new Trump administration is moving quickly to dismantle decades of protections for our clean air, water, and public lands. The Natural Resources Defense Council has proved it can stop these attacks. NRDC filed the first environmental lawsuit against the previous Trump administration and maintained a blistering pace, filing 163 legal challenges and winning victories in nearly 90% of resolved cases to protect wolves, bees, and other endangered species, block the Keystone XL pipeline, regulate chemicals hazardous to our health, and more. Now, NRDC is launching the legal fund to stop the Trump agenda. For a limited time, all donations will be doubled to help power their strongest legal defense of our environment yet. From climate protection to endangered species, what we do now will determine the world our children inherit. Make your match gift at nrdc.org/podcast.
Support comes from USA for UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency. This winter, your gift to USA for UNHCR will make all the difference. As temperatures drop, your generosity brings critical relief to those forced to flee and facing winter far from home. Your gift to UNHCR gives core relief items like food, blankets, shelter, and fuel for heaters. These life-saving essentials are quickly transported to warehouses around the globe, ready to be delivered by UNHCR's dedicated teams. It's a race against time to provide more than just the basics for those in need. UNHCR's swift response, fueled by your support, ensures refugees and displaced people receive life-saving aid, helping them survive the harshest conditions. UNHCR is committed to using every dollar wisely and turning your compassion into action. Help those in need stay warm and safe. Your gift is matched for a limited time. Give now at unrefugees.org/winter.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. The new year brings new health goals and wealth goals. Protecting your identity is an important step. LifeLock monitors millions of data points per second. If your identity is stolen, LifeLock's restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Resolve to make identity health and wealth part of your New Year's goals with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
I want to talk about what happens next with these executive orders and policies and how they might be followed up on in the coming weeks and months. What are you looking at from these executive orders that you think, in weeks ahead, we might be hearing more about?
Well, I'm interested in whether he tries to use the Justice Department to go after private companies or universities that still want to uphold diversity as a value.
Yeah, I think you're talking about the fact that in these executive orders, agencies are tasked with the idea of finding 9 different organizations that they think are using DEI practices and might be investigated for them. Am I characterizing that right?
Yeah, I think the notion that companies might be discriminating, that DEI equals discrimination, and whether it be against white people or Asians at Harvard or Christians. It's like the conservative playbook takes whatever the civil rights movement did and they take it for themselves and use it. And so the tools that were created to fight discrimination are now going to be used by white conservatives or Christian evangelicals to say, we're being discriminated against by your policies.
It's such an upending of the Office of Civil Rights at the DOJ. It's like a total inside-out world. Can you imagine? And I don't have to imagine. I have friends who work in that office. What are they telling you? I know a lot of people who are planning to leave, not just the office, but the country. Yeah. Can we talk about the elements of these executive orders that encourage government workers to tell on each other? Notably, in one of the executive orders, there's an email address, write to this email address and explain how your colleagues are enmeshed with DEI. Right. And in the Department of Homeland Security, it was there will be adverse consequences if you don't tell. So you've got 10 days to think about it, but on the 10th day, you better let me know. And so, there's this sense that there are kind of these administrative knife fights going on behind the scenes of people, anyone who wants to make sure they keep their job or suck up to the new administration can just go and sort of say, oh, that person over there who is my rival in the office, that person was really a DEI person and that person supports, because it's not just DEI. If you look at that, if you read that, it's it was similar ideologies. So what's a similar ideology? It's interesting to look at these two efforts together. The effort to have civil servants sort of rat each other out and the effort for civil servants to rat out organizations that they work with that may be doing things that the administration doesn't agree with. Because to me, it has the effect of it could make working in civil service very unappealing for a lot of people. And in fact, the head of the American Federation of Government Employees, which is a union representing 750,000 federal workers, has said this is basically just a smokescreen for firing civil servants or driving them out. I wonder what you make of that.
I think that's absolutely true. I mean, I think there's a lot of people right now who are weighing whether they can afford to leave their jobs because they don't want to be a part of this administration for a whole host of reasons, but this being just one of them. But yes, I think this is part of an effort to shrink the federal government and make sure that the ones who are left think just like you do.
And then at the same time, I look at the effort to, call out other organizations, and I think this could be a way to rapidly dismantle a lot of institutions that have become pretty enmeshed with the federal government that Trump doesn't like places like universities that rely on grants from the government, nonprofit organizations that maybe have run some of these outsourced tasks that the federal government has, given them. And I just think, this accomplishes a whole lot of projects all at once to sort of begin this process of telling on people internally and people externally.
Well, I think we should take them seriously when they say that they want to absolutely change the culture of the country and move it to the right. This is a massive cultural project. They feel that, we have the Supreme Court and the White House and Silicon Valley, but a lot of conservatives feel like they lost the culture war that Hollywood and universities and the music industry and comedians were all liberal, and that now they are trying to change that. And this is just a sort of an opening salvo of this very big, ambitious effort to push the culture to the right.
I have this question I've been thinking about a little bit during this conversation. I wonder if you've thought about it too. Do you think there was a way to level the playing field for all Americans to have access to jobs, equity, without producing a backlash like this?
I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer to that. But I do think that the way that we talk about it sometimes, as if everyone can have equality and it doesn't cost anyone, I just think that's unrealistic. When you're talking about jobs, it's usually a zero-sum game. Like if one person gets a job, somebody else doesn't get that job, right? And so you are asking people to give something up. You are asking people to say, you know what, in the interest of fairness, your kind has always been hired. Can you just this once go and look elsewhere so we can hire a person who's never gotten a chance? And, that's a bitter pill to swallow. And part of the reason it's such a bitter pill is that our economy doesn't feel so good right now for a whole hell of a lot of people. And, I know we're talking about how strong the economy is and how great the stock market is. And, no, for a whole lot of people, they're really struggling. And so they don't want to hear about let someone else have a chance right now. So I guess this is a bigger way to say that DEI is important, but I think the bigger thing I think we also have to look at is whether some of these actions are being used by Trump to sort of get us all spun up about race, when really there's massive economic inequality, even when you're talking about poor whites. And I wish we could have gotten to a point where working people are demanding a government that delivers for them and a system that says, billionaires should pay more. And, the federal government is the only counterweight to those billionaires. They're increasingly making up a bigger and bigger part of our economy. And now Trump's just gotten in bed with them. And so and he's about to pass a tax cut that favors them. And so that's kind of the ball we should be looking at too. It's not just about how we divide ourselves racially, but how can we unite on a bigger level against the things that he's doing that actually are destructive to all of us.
It sounds like you're saying Trump is saying, hey, I'll give you this DEI thing as long as I can get some tax cuts for my rich friends.
I mean, it's the oldest trick in the book, right? Is, let's tell some working class white people that they'll, here, have whiteness. At least you're better than black people. And, you're going to get the crappy jobs in the coal mines or whatever it was. I think that is the oldest trick in the book.
Farah, I'm really grateful for your time and your reporting. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Farah Stockman is a member of the New York Times editorial board. She's also the author of American Made: What Happens to People When Work Disappears. And that's our show. What Next is produced by Paige, Osburn, Elena, Schwartz, Rob Gunther, Anna Phillips, and Madeline Ducharme. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations here at Slate. And I'm Mary Harris. If you want to see pictures of where I've been for the last few days, go over to Blue Sky. I'm at Mary Harris. Thanks for listening. Catch you back here next time.